Okay. Good morning. It looks like it's time to start. So we will get underway. Looks like our stand here has been upgraded. I have to get used to that one. So we're continuing with the Misquoted series. I'm not sure how many weeks we are in now, 5 or 6, somewhere in that neighborhood. This morning's passage that we're going to be looking at comes from Matthew 18. Maybe the most misquoted part of this is verse 20 there, but we're going to look at this and emphasize those 3 verses to get the picture. So these 3 verses just to set the stage, and honestly, we're gonna read this, and then we're not going to read much for several minutes because we're going to go back and get some background material. Truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall have been bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall have been loosed in heaven. Again, I say to you that if 2 of you agree on earth about anything that they may ask, it shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. For where 2 or 3 have gathered together in my name, I am there in their midst. Okay, that last line, where 2 or 3 have gathered together, I am there in their midst. This is one that you will sometimes hear used. Maybe the crowd isn't as large as it always is, and somebody will say, well, where 2 or 3 are gathered together, Jesus is in their midst, and we can worship. I think we're going to find that one is main problem is it's taken out of context. So our series so far has been a great study in context. Just about every one of these misquoted passages, the main reason they're misquoted is because people look at them in isolation. They read that line and it's a good line and they can make it mean something they really like. And that may even be true, but that's not what the message is because of the greater context. So we're going to spend a while this morning. We're going to look at all of chapter 18. And I've got these divisions marked that we're going to go through. I will say that after I put all the notes together, I kind of wish that I had split it at 1 to 5 and then 6 through 11 on those first 2 sections. Those first 2 are really tied together, so you could split it up either way, and the message would be the same. It might have made a little bit more logical sense, but it is what it is. So we're going to look at these. All right, verses 1 to 6. I hopefully have passed out the verses written correctly, so if you will read that. Go ahead and read 1 through 6, because the slide is going to cover verse 6.
Consistent with the slide. At that time, the disciples came to Jesus, saying, "Who is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven?" And calling to him a child, he put him in the midst of them and said, "Truly I say to you, unless you turn and become like children, you will never enter the kingdom of heaven. Whoever humbles himself like this child is the greatest in the kingdom of heaven. Whoever receives one such child in my name receives me. But whoever causes one of these little ones who believe in me to sin, it would be better for him to have a great millstone fastened around his neck, and be drowned in the depth of the sea.
All right. Thank you, Robert. Maybe I should have set the stage. You kick off verse 18, or chapter 18, rather. At the end of chapter 17, you'd read where, they had come to Capernaum. So they were not in the area of Jerusalem. They were in the northern part, in the area of Galilee. And all of chapter 18 does seem to be in that same context, because Matthew's basically got it written in chronological order. So they went to Capernaum, and then you kick off 19, and it says, they went down to Judea. So Matthew groups this chapter, together chronologically, and it really does flow. This is actually, I loved doing this study, the context part of it, because when you look at the big picture, they're all going to fit together. Okay, so chapter 18, as we were reading. The question was posed, and if you look at some parallel passages, this was a discussion point among the disciples on the road, and Jesus says, "What were y'all talking about?" So then Peter will ask a question. Who is the greatest? So what I want us to do as we go through these sections, any one of these could be a complete lesson in and of itself with plenty to talk about. But let's, most of us are not here for the first time. So let's go over these. You've seen these before. I do want to touch on everything. Let's get the feel for what the message is in these passages. So the question is, who then is the greatest? How does Jesus answer? Is the first thing he does spout out some words? That's right. He is the master at illustrations, is he not? With the parables he taught, he calls a child over. It's like a visual parable that he's showing them. He calls this child over and says, "What do you need to do? Who will be the greatest? The one who becomes like this child." It says, "Truly I say to you, unless you are converted and become like children, whoever then humbles himself is the greatest in the kingdom." So he says, here's this child. Who is the greatest in the kingdom? And he says, it's the humble, but then he follows it up. He doesn't just let it go there. What does he tell them? Verse 5. Yeah, when you receive a child, when you receive one such child, you receive me. And what's the parallel? Who are the children? Humble people. His people are the children in this illustration. So he says, whoever receives a child receives me, but then whoever causes one to stumble. So the one who is humble is the greatest, but you've got this lesson in how you deal with each other. It says, do not, whoever causes one of these ones who believe in me. I left out little because, he starts with a child, but then he's saying this applies to the kingdom. The question was, who's the greatest in the kingdom of heaven? So he says, here is an example. The humility here is an example of those who are the greatest. But you need to look at how you interact. He says, whoever causes one of these ones who believe in me to stumble, it would be better to drown in the sea. So what's he telling them to do? do not, boy, nobody wants to talk this morning. Not a trick question. Somebody say it. Do not cause them to stumble. Do not cause one of my children to sin. Okay? So, this section, who is the greatest? The greatest are the humble, but you need to watch how you interact. It's about humility, and the takeaway here is it's about relationships. The kingdom will be people interacting with each other, and you have to be careful how you interact. By the way, I have on each of these sections, I've got a bullet at the end that says takeaway. These are the things that I want us to remember when we get to looking at the context. So the takeaway lines, I couldn't summarize the whole passage maybe in a couple of words, but just bear with me for lack of space. Mm-hmm. Yes, that's right. I mean, by definition, if you go back to your English class, greatest, you have great, greater, and greatest. Greatest means the one that's above all the others. Greater may compare to where you have one is greater than another, but you're right. Who is the greatest? Who is going to be at the very top of greatness? And he says, the people that are humble. The people that are humble, that's what I value. And the people that are careful about how they interact with my children. So we're going to just sum that one up, that verses 1 through 6, maybe 5. Like I said, the first two overlap. It's about those relationships, and it's about humility. And honestly, I can't tell you why he started pushing, the lesson in and of itself, who is the greatest, is an important thing for his disciples to pick up. But then he pushes it a little bit different direction. He is has been called the master teacher. He knows that they are needing the lessons that he's going to give them. So he follows it up with verses 7 through 11. Someone read that, please. Thank you. So what does he say is going to come? Temptation. Woe to the world because of its stumbling blocks. So Keith, you were actually getting into my next question. What is a stumbling block? It's that temptation, right? So you come across things that you trip over. I love that illustration. A lot of the times you don't even see that thing that you trip over. Sometimes you do, and then you just feel silly. But most of the time you don't see it. You're walking along the sidewalk, and the sidewalk has buckled a little bit. I mean, you don't see it, and you trip over it. It comes up on you before you know what's happening, and you stumble. Now remember, what's our context here? What did we just talked about in verses 1 to 6? Don't cause one of my children to sin. And then he says, there's going to be stumbling blocks. There's going to be that temptation. I'm skipping ahead. Now let me ask you a question. If you read this about the things that make you stumble, there are stumbling blocks in the world. We don't have time to talk about the cutting it off, other than what do you do when you know there's a stumbling block? Say again? You avoid it. That's right. You get rid of it. You go around it. Okay? So you're trying to avoid those stumbling blocks. In the context of this, don't cause your brother to sin. Could a stumbling block be a who and not just a what? Yes. And that's exactly the meaning behind, don't be a stumbling block. Don't cause one of my little ones to sin. There's going to be stumbling blocks. And then he ties it back in verse 10. He comes back around and says, do not despise one of these little ones. So that shows you that this whole thing is tied together, and we've got, in the kingdom, we should be humble and we should be careful with what we do with our brothers and sisters. Those people, we should be careful that we do not act as a stumbling block and draw them away. Mm-hmm. Yeah, go ahead.
Satan uses those that are closest to us, or maybe even family members, to attempt to pull us away from God.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of times, because it's a close friend or a family member, it may be harder to pick up on.
Absolutely. Yeah, those that are closest to us, whether it's a family member, we're talking about the kingdom here. This is saying there may be somebody in the kingdom that is giving you an opportunity to stumble. I almost said makes you stumble. Ultimately, we're not forced to stumble, but we can certainly be drawn by that temptation. So how do we respond to a stumbling block? We already talked a little bit about this. What do we do? That big long section about if your hand or your foot causes you to stumble, what do? You get rid of it. That's right. He says cut it off. Now it's kind of a graphic example, but maybe it's not the most enjoyable thought to visualize. But yeah, he's saying you might have to do something drastic to avoid that stumbling block.
The person that causes someone to stumble, how do we respond? Well, if that's somebody that's causing you to go into this stumbling, you need to cut the relationship off from them. The lessons I taught a while back on friendship talks about a friend does not come along and say, hey, yeah, let's go do this thing wrong. It grabs your hand and takes you away from that terrible thing and says, let's run over here to the good stuff and not to this bad stuff. But, a friend or a person that's causing you to be in temptation, you need to cut that relationship off sometimes.
That's right. Cutting off that stumbling block may be cutting off one of those relationships that's not good for us. Mm-hmm.
Kind of graphic, I think is the word you said, and that always is what it feels like. But to me, that's kind of the point. I mean, Jesus, he could have used a lot of language here to describe getting rid of something, but that idea of cutting out a part of us, I think it shows the intentionality and the level of seriousness that he takes this. It may hurt, it may seem like a lot, it may seem like a big sacrifice, but that's how important it is. If there's something that's causing a stumbling block between you and God, you should be willing to do anything.
Yes.
I mean, going as far as to seemingly hurt yourself, but if it puts you in a better relationship with God, it's worth it.
Yeah. And we're going to get into more of this chapter 18 stuff that may actually, not explicitly, but come back and be an example of this cutting your hand off or cutting out your eye. Okay, so what's our takeaway here? Go ahead.
This is a little out there, which might not surprise you coming from me, but some of the seniors in here may recall a Jewish comedian by the name of David Brenner. And he made just hilarious comments, and one of them was about the person that is walking down the street and trips on the sidewalk. The very first thing he does is to turn around and see what the offense was that caused him to stumble. And part of that is out of embarrassment because other people may be watching. But thinking about that in this context, I'm thinking the person that stumbles and immediately turns around to look is looking for an excuse, a reason why he stumbled outside of himself. And you know, what I need to do is look inward, not behind me.
Right.
And I need to study my surroundings spiritually and physically so I know where the stumbling blocks are. I can identify them before I trip and fall on my face.
That's right. We need to know. We need to be looking out ahead of us, maybe more so than behind us. We need to know, yeah, I tend to drag my feet. And when I drag my feet, they catch on all those stumbling blocks. Okay, so takeaway here. We say, you know, we need to get rid of the stumbling blocks. So don't let our relationship cause us to sin. But at the same time, we already said, don't be a stumbling block to someone else. So we're tied back in with that first section. So the takeaway is don't cause stumbling and sin. Yeah. Have to keep moving. Matthew 18, verses 12 to 14. You know,
What do you think? If a man has 100 sheep, and one of them goes astray, does he not leave the 99 and go to the mountains to seek the one that's straying? And if he should find it, assuredly I say to you, he rejoices more over that one sheep than over the 99 that did not go astray. Even so, it is not the will of your Father who is in heaven that one of these little ones should perish.
all right, thank you. So now we've gone from children to sheep. You know, there's another really good parable from Luke 15. What does Jesus use as an illustration for his people? Sheep. And there's a lot of lessons you could do there. Like I said, we don't have time to do a whole lesson on each one of these. But yeah, we're talking about the sheep. Now he says the guy has 100. What happens? What happens to one of those? He goes astray. That's right. What does it mean to go astray? He leaves the flock. So in the context of Jesus talking about, you know, his children, and now we've got his flock, what is it when somebody leaves the flock? They go back to the world. They have gone back to sin. See, this idea of sin keeps coming back. We've got one that, 100 sheep, one goes astray. What happens when the one that has gone astray is found? What's that symbolic of? If going astray was going back to the world, comes back, that's right. So they come back, they have given up. They said, no, I've been sinning, I need to be back with the flock. I need to be following the shepherd. So here we are. We've got children that need to be humble, but we need to be careful. Do not be a stumbling block. Do not, if we continue our whole big picture context, do not be the one that causes that sheep to get lost, for it to wander off. Keep it together. Keep it in the flock. So here, once again, we're building up our big picture. And then finally in this passage, what's the response when that lost one comes back? Rejoicing. And it says, he being the shepherd, he rejoices over it more than over the 99 which have not gone astray. Again, Luke 15 is a really good.
Sheep don't find themselves coming back. They'll come back themselves. That's why I said you have to go out and find them. Find the true said that you rejoice when you go out and spend the effort to have that person come back. But if the person's sheep stays away, they don't really come back themselves.
Sheep are not known for being very intelligent, are they? In many ways, we aren't very intelligent sometimes. So the takeaway here, let's come down to that last section. He will rejoice over it, and it's not your will that any should perish. So the takeaway is the repentance of a sinner is cause for celebration. So now we've got our group dynamic, we've got interacting, do not sin, do not cause someone to sin, but when someone sins and they come back, there's rejoicing. So here for verses 12 to 14, restoring the lost sinner is the goal. And I am going too slow. We'll have to speed up a little bit. All right, Matthew 18, verses 15 to 17. We could get our reader for that one.
You have won your brother over. But if he will not listen, take one or two others along, so that every matter may be established by the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. If he refuses to listen to them, tell it to the church. If he refuses to listen even to the church, treat him as you would a pagan or a tax collector.
All right, thank you. All right. I'm glad you read what you did, because there's a little bit of a translation thing that you find in some translations and not others, and it's that phrase, against you. Not all of the translations will have that, and I'm not going to make today a debate over whether that should be there or not. If you look at that context, it does seem like it could be a personal thing. If you leave out the against you, it says, if your brother sins, go and show him his fault in private. Well, you're the only one that knows about this problem, right? It's not unreasonable, maybe not a sure thing, but it's not unreasonable that we're talking about a one-on-one conflict, an issue here. Your brother has sinned, but it has been directed towards you. Again, don't have time for that debate today. But you've got someone who has sinned, nevertheless. How does this sinning brother compare to the 99 and the 1? Where do they fall in that group? They're the one, yeah, right? So remember that. We've talked about what happened, what was the goal of our previous paragraph. We wanted that lost one to come back. All right, so I don't know that I've got a lot of time. Like I said, I should have abbreviated earlier. There's a process here that he talks about. If there is a brother who has sinned, he says, go to him in private. And then he says, if he hears you, you've gained your brother, and we'll come back to that. If he doesn't, take 1 or 2 more. And then he quotes, let's see, the words that are marked as the quote, plus or minus a word here. By the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses, every fact may be confirmed. That's from Deuteronomy 19 and verses 15 to 19. Can we read that one, please? Is that one? Maybe I missed that one.
No, I got it.
Oh,
Put it in the wrong spot.
sorry about that.
Sorry.
Snuck one up on you.
I have chapter 5. Okay, 19, 15 through 19. A single witness shall not suffice against a person for any crime or for any wrong in connection with an offense that he has committed. Only on the evidence of 2 witnesses or of 3 witnesses shall a charge be established.
Okay, let's go ahead and stop there for time. Only on the witness of only on the testimony of 2 or 3 witnesses. Why not just one? What might happen? Yeah, there may be a little accident. There may not be completely on the up and up. So you get 2 or 3 witnesses, and dare I add, reliable, trusted witnesses to help settle that dispute. Jesus comes out and he tells them the same thing. You know, if you go to the person and he doesn't listen, then take 1 or 2 more. And if that doesn't work, then take it to the church. And that parallel back to Deuteronomy 19 is completely there when it says take it to the church. Because in Deuteronomy it says you can take it before the Lord and the priests and the judges. So we've got that same context. The people hearing this are going to know exactly what he's talking about. The outcome is either going to be you gain a brother. You might get that in the first step, you might get it in the second step, you might get it in the third, but the outcome is either you gain a brother or you be as a Gentile or as a tax collector. Real quick, little interesting tidbit. Matthew's writing this. What was his occupation? He was a tax collector. That's right. I wonder if that hit home when Jesus said this. Okay. Moving ahead, when there is sin and conflict, we need to address the issue. And again, we have one of 2 options. But the goal is restoration. The goal is to restore the sinner and to restore that relationship. So we'll put that one down. And then the one that we're not going to have time, we're going to skip over verses 18 to 20 for a bit. 21 to 35, we don't have time. That is, we're talking about restoring someone. And Peter asks, how many times shall I forgive my brother? 7 times? Because in Jewish law, that was a lot. And Jesus says, no, 70 times 7. A whole bunch more than that. And then we have this parable about the servant who owes his master unbelievable amounts beyond what he could ever hope to pay, and the master forgives him. Then that servant goes to another servant who owes him, relatively speaking, pennies, nothing, and he says, throw you in prison but until you pay what you owe me. That was one of those kingdom parables. And the lesson is that there are expectations when the debtor, the one who owes something, then becomes the one who is owed. That servant who was in debt beyond what he could ever hope to repay, he became the one who was owed, and he did not show the same forgiveness and the same mercy as the master had. So you come down and you look at it in our greater context. God forgives us sometimes beyond what we should ever hope to make up for. And then what's the lesson for the interpersonal part? Remember, we've got these sheep and we've got the children that are interacting with each other. How should we react to someone? Say it again. Forgiving spirit, that's right. This one is all about mercy and forgiveness. So here we are. Now we've got our context, and I've got 7 minutes to go. I wanted to have about 15 when I got here. Okay. So we finally get back to 18. And here's our context. We've got humility, don't cause someone to sin, restoring the lost sinner is the goal. The goals of confronting a sinner are repentance of the sinner and restoring the relationship. And then afterwards, we've got this incredible parable about how much mercy and forgiveness God gives us, and we should do the same. So what do you think when we get into verses 18 to 20 we're going to be talking about? Dealing with this sin, it comes right after a procedure for confronting a sinner. And it's sandwiched between restoring a sinner and forgiving a sinner. So truly I say to you, whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven, and whatever you loose on earth shall be loosed in heaven. I'm going to pause right there. Bind and loose. What's that about? Most of the time, when we read the Bible, things are pretty plain. But every now and then there are some words that crop up that are not obvious. Because of time, I'm just going to go ahead and tell you. Bind and loose were common legal terms to the Jews in the first century. They're used by Josephus, they're used in the Talmud. Bind means to prohibit or forbid, and loose would mean to allow or to permit. And just one brief example, this was from Josephus. It talks about the Pharisees were the administrators, and they were empowered to banish and readmit, as well as to loose and to bind. So these were common, this was how people would have understood this. So bind or loose what? What did we just got through talking about in verse, 16, 17? What was he telling people to do? If they don't respond to the church, what are you to do?
Saying whatever is decided on this situation, that's the decision. That's going to be bound in heaven as well as on earth. If you decide this person should be a tax collector and removed from the church, that's, it's agreed with on 2 or 3 more people.
That's right. Did they associate with Gentiles? No, they didn't. Let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector. So in this situation, they are not permitting, they are binding this relationship with the sinner. They're saying, don't associate with the sinners. Now, it could be that the relationship is loosed if the sinner repents. So, we could, I skipped over, there's some stuff in 1 Corinthians 5 and 6 that talks about do not associate with these people because of the influence. And it says that it's to bring them back. So that's what we're trying to do. It says this relationship is not permitted. Well, when was it? Another point of possible confusion. Whatever you bind on earth shall be bound in heaven. Can man's decisions dictate action? Again, this is a little bit deep into the translation bits. The reference I read said, this is the future perfect passive in the Greek, which means absolutely nothing to me. But consistent reading gives the fact that it was something better said, perhaps, shall have already been bound. And then you can see different translations. ESV says, shall be bound in heaven and shall be loosed in heaven, but New American Standard, shall have been bound in heaven. Does that make it sound a little less like, well, we decided to disfellowship this person, so God's going to follow what we said? Do we mandate what decisions God makes? No. Again, a bit deep into the translation parts, but read some different translations. Yeah.
One note on why there's a difference in translation is because the perfect tense is used in mainly two ways. One of them is an action that has already been taken, and the second one is sort of a stative action, so something that's describing like a state. So basically, it might, the reason why there's a difference in translation is because it is possible, very possible, that it is something that happens in the future. It's not something that's already happened, but it's just sort of a Greek idiom thing. So that's why there's like a difference in translation.
Yeah. Thank you. Didn't know we had a Greek scholar here. Thank you. So we move along, since I am 1 minute to go, well, maybe 2. Again, I say to you that if any 2 of you agree on earth about anything they may ask, it shall be done for them by my Father who is in heaven. For where 2 or 3 have gathered together in my name, I am there in their midst. Is there anything that's repeated there that kind of jumps out at you? Say again?
3 and 1.
Yes! That 2 or 3 thing keeps coming up. We had it in verse 16. Take 1 or 2 more. So add that to you. That's 2 or 3. And then it quotes from Deuteronomy, which says 2 or 3 witnesses will confirm a fact. Then in 19, if 2 of you agree, and in 20, 2 or 3 of you have gathered together. What are the 2 or 3 of you gathered together to do? That's right. To talk to this brother about sin. So we've got this thing. It ties all of this together in that this thing about where 2 or 3 are gathered together, I am with you. It's still talking about dealing with a sinning brother. So the last thing to discuss, and unfortunately we don't have a lot of discussion time, to complete the thought, verse 19. So we've got kind of, honestly, in my opinion, I think we've got 18, 19 are parallel verses. Whatever you bind on earth, if the decision has been made to withdraw from this person, that's the thing that has been agreed upon in verse 19. It shall be done for them by the Father. It goes back to it will have been bound in heaven or loosed in heaven. And then at the end, verse 24, that's because this other stuff has happened because where 2 or 3 have gathered together, I am in their midst. So this one is tying this last bow around it, honestly, I think is the hardest part to summarize. So I've got one that I created. Anybody want to summarize what is the message of 18 to 20? That's right. That's right. And the reason to talk this is it has nothing to do with worship. Now, it's a great, truth that when 2 or 3 are gathered together that, we can worship, but one person can worship. It doesn't take 2 or 3 to worship. That previous verse, whatever he asks kind of alludes to prayer. God hears prayer of one person. So those are the kind of the misquoted side of it. Go ahead.
Jim, the way that I look at it and kind of summarize every verse that's 1 through 35. One is we need to be humble. Mm-hmm. And 2, we can't sit here. Just like the 99. If he didn't go out looking for that one, then he would have never found it. So we as a church need to, in multiples, go out and seek those that are lost. And, you know, there's many, even our ladies on Tuesdays go visiting in multiples and visit with people. And then if we have issues with them, I mean, we need to forgive and go out and seek them. So one is, we can't just sit here as a congregation. We have to go out and seek those people.
Yes.
But be humble and forgiving.
That's right. Yeah, over and over, you know, we have down here, the goal is restoring the lost sinner and forgiveness. Go ahead.
If we identify ourselves as a Christian, and while we're here, we're just fine. But when we go out in the world and are living our life, we can be a stumbling block as far as bringing them to Christ. If we give an example that's not Christian. So we have to keep that in mind every day.
Yes. So again, coming back to that caution, don't be a stumbling block. Oops. Mm-hmm. Yep. So real quick, Jim's paraphrase here to sum up these verses. It's not about do you have to have some to worship? It's if you deal with these relationships that have the sin, if you deal with a sinning brother by God's plan to take, private, take two, etc., and with His priorities in mind, forgiveness and restoration, He's going to bless the process. That's where two or three are gathered together to address this sinning brother, I will be with them if you follow my plan. I'm over, I'm sorry.